Remember way back when we first mentioned localizers as we talked about en route charts? You'll recall that localizers are sometimes used for identifying fixes on en route charts and that they're 4 times as sensitive as VORs. Well, back then we promised that we'd show you how to fly a localizer, and now the time has come to deliver on that promise. Let's begin by discussing how the Course Deviation Indicator, or CDI, behaves when you fly a localizer. If you're right smack on the localizer center line, the CDI needle will be centered. If you're not on the center line, the needle will be deflected toward the center line. In other words, if the needle is deflected to the right, the localizer center line is to your right, and you'll have to turn your airplane to the right to intercept the center line. This is true even if you fly over the runway and continue beyond the runway. As long as you fly the localizer the direction it's primarily intended to be flown, that's called flying the front course. To fly a localizer, your technique is based on 2 simple ideas. First, stop any needle movement, and second, make small corrections sooner instead of big corrections later. Remember that localizers are very sensitive, but as long as you keep the needle in the center, you'll be in good shape. Getting the needle to the center, however, takes some practice. So let's fly a localizer course. We'll begin by intercepting the final approach course. When you're being radar vectored, the controller will usually aim you toward the final approach course at about a 20 to 30 degree intercept angle. If you're navigating on your own, say from a procedure turn, that intercept angle could be bigger, as much as a 45 degree intercept. Whichever way you approach the center line, when the needle moves off the peg, start a standard rate turn to the approach course heading. Some pilots will take up a heading that already has a wind correction if they know the direction of a crosswind. That's fine, but you want to limit this Kentucky windage initially to no more than 5 degrees off the published course. And when you roll out on the approach heading, don't worry if the needle isn't perfectly centered yet, as long as it's fairly close. What you're looking for is any needle movement, so hold your heading for a short time. Now look at the CDI needle. If it moves, you need to make small course adjustments, no more than 5 degrees, to stop its movement. If it doesn't move, great! You've discovered the heading that stops the needle movement. This will be your reference heading on the localizer. Some pilots call this the tracking heading. Others call it simply the stopper heading because it stops the needle movement. But whatever you call it, this is the heading on which you'll base your approach course corrections. If you're not on the localizer center line, take up a heading now that will get you to the center line. Once you're on the center, then turn back to the stopper heading. If you drift off the center line, make small corrections to regain the center line. And when you're making those corrections, don't turn any more than 5 degrees either side of the stopper heading. As you get closer to the runway, say within 5 miles or so, your heading corrections should now be no more than about 2 degrees. Now, when you're flying a localizer course, it's tempting to concentrate on the CDI needle, but the needle only tells you what you should do about your heading. To make heading corrections, your best friends are the attitude indicator and the heading indicator. The secret to making those small heading corrections is to bank the number of degrees that you want to turn. So for example, if you wanted to make a 3-degree heading change, you'd use a 3-degree bank. The important thing is to not hold the bank for too long. It's more like roll it in, then roll it out. Once you make the correction and your wings are level, check your heading, then check the CDI needle. Depending on how fast the needle is moving, you may want to lead your turn back to that stopper heading. This method works like a charm in most cases, but if the wind changes and your heading doesn't stop the needle movement, what would you do? Well, then you'd simply add corrections in 5-degree increments from your initial heading until you find a heading that keeps the needle steady. And if you make a correction and it reverses the needle movement, then the stopper heading lies somewhere between that correction and your previous heading. Now here's where it gets a little tricky. If you turn your airplane around and fly the opposite direction on the localizer course, that's called flying the back course. Then the CDI will exhibit what's known as reverse sensing. The CDI needle will point away from the center line instead of towards it. So when you're flying the localizer on the back course heading, you fly away from the displaced needle to return to the center line. Think of it as dragging the needle with you. That can make a localizer back course approach like this one here pretty interesting. The good thing is that you don't find very many back course approaches these days. Now there are a couple of ways that you can avoid reverse sensing on a back course approach. One way is to have a navigation receiver with a BC or back course switch. Pressing that switch manually reverses the signal indication, and you can then follow the CDI needle like normal. Another way is if your airplane has a horizontal situation indicator, or HSI, and if you're lucky enough to fly an airplane so equipped, consider yourself blessed. With an HSI, you just leave the course select pointer set on the front course inbound direction. Then, regardless of whether you're flying the front course or the back course, you fly toward the course deviation bar on the HSI to get on the localizer center line. So as you've discovered, flying a localizer is really pretty simple. Just remember to make little tiny corrections sooner instead of big corrections later. And as you get closer and closer to the airport, make smaller and smaller corrections. Now, while a localizer can be used by itself for a non-precision approach, most of the localizers you'll fly will be combined with a glide slope to give you a precision ILS approach. So if you learn to fly a localizer well, you'll be halfway to mastering the ILS.